This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global MedTech community at mystrategist.com. Welcome to the first episode of Market Pathways. Today, Stephen Levin, our editor-in-chief, talks with Serge Bernasconi, CEO of European Trade Association, MedTech Europe, about the recently implemented MDR and its current and future implications.
Let me thank you, as always, for joining us in what is really a kind of a momentous occasion, just from the perspective of, for so many years, we've been talking about when MDR comes, and then, of course, with COVID, it was delayed by a year. But now that it's here, let me just ask you, start with a general question, which is, what does the climate feel like in the MedTech community in Europe now that we're past May 26th when MDR was implemented? Does it feel any different, or is this going to be more of a gradual process?
Well, first of all, hello, Steve. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure, and if we can, maintain the communication between Europe and you all, particularly with the US, it's great. I think we need to. I mean, at the end of the day, we are all in the same boat here, and we're all trying to move forward our industry. So, related to this MDR and your question, I think it's a bit of a mixed feeling today. Frankly, I mean, the first feeling is that okay, that's it. So now, okay, we've passed now this date, this critical date, which for me, the first thing, it is more the end of an older system. Okay, that's the first thing, is that you cannot use anymore the medical device directive to file in product in Europe. That's what this date is saying. As such, it is also fully opening the only option you have now, which is if you want to file a product in Europe, you now have to do it using the medical device regulation, and all its requirements. So that's what it means. Now, if you look at the products, for the vast majority of existing products, products which are currently on the market, a lot of people have prepared this. They were able to file, let's say, most of the time under the medical device directive prior to the due date. And so their products are going to be on the market for the next 3-4 years, with a maximum date now of May 2024.
Let me interrupt you there, because for people who aren't familiar with the idea of the grace period, maybe you could explain that in a little more detail.
Sure. Okay, so what does this grace period mean? Grace period means that if you had a product on the market prior to May 26, 2021, and that you basically refiled your product, renewed your certificate prior to that date, that certificate is now going to be valid for the time of the certificate to the maximum of May 2024. Okay. As of May 2024, you will have to have refiled your product using the medical device regulation requirements to stay on the market after May 2024. Now, if you have a new product and that product did not have a certificate prior to May 2021, then you have to file using the requirements of the new regulation. Okay, and that's what's a bit tricky, because obviously that due date kind of is a major change.
Right.
It is not going to change if you are the product on the market. The product's going to be, and I think there was a tremendous amount of work done by companies to get ready for that, to make sure that everything was going to be filed and that product will stay on the market. And in fact, we don't see a situation right now in Europe where suddenly, oh my goodness, products are not available anymore. We don't see that. Okay, but let's not fool ourselves. It's, for me, now starts the reality of the new regulation, because now anything you're going to do is going to have to respond to the new regulation requirements. And you have about 3 years, let's say, 2021, to be ready.
So it sounds like what you're hearing from your members of MedTech Europe, that companies generally prepared for the MDR and they took advantage of having the additional year by virtue of the delay for COVID to either file under MDR or get the grace period
Renewal.
under MDD. So that's a positive sign. You're not.
Yes, I think this 1 year was useful for that. I mean, at least it gave extra time for companies, but it's also very useful in continuing to get the system ready, because that's the other major challenge that we're facing now. Is now, since we do not have anymore the medical device directive system, now the system has got to be working. Because if it is not, then we have a big issue. So if we had pressure prior to May 26, 2021, the level of pressure has even increased more now on the institutions to get the system ready as quickly and as efficiently as possible, so that companies can file now using the new regulation. And there's still a lot to do. As you know, we only have today about 20 notified body available. We've been working.
I want to get into that separately, but there were a number of concerns about potential bottlenecks, and I think the first one was whether companies were going to prepare in a timely manner for the new MDR. And it sounds like what you're saying is largely companies have gotten things in order, so there's been no bottleneck right out of the chute, so to speak. Let me ask you one other. Yeah.
I don't know if there was no bottleneck, but at least we it seems that we're doing fine.
Right. Let me ask you one question regarding COVID. We talked about COVID being the reason for the delay for a year. There were certain practices that were put in place for COVID, and I'm thinking specifically of allowing temporarily anyway, remote audits.
Yes.
And I'd be interested in your perspective on whether you see some of those new processes like temporary audits perhaps being made permanent. I mean, in aspects of the U.S. health system, for example, we're seeing things like patient remote monitoring and other things, that telehealth, that are likely to stick around even after the pandemic concludes. Are we likely to see the same thing in Europe, and what would fall under that category?
Look, there was a big issue indeed because of the COVID to be able to get the system going, since people could not travel, to obtain the authorization to practice what's called remote auditing. Okay, to be able to be granted basically a green light to have access to the market. This was essentially approved and okayed by the institution a few months ago. Now, the application of this has not been to the level of our expectations. We see places where they practice it relatively openly, and that's great. But we also see countries who do not accept it. Germany is one which basically has not really accepted remote auditing. And that's an issue because obviously that slows down the process, as you can imagine, to get product approved or product to the market. So the intention is there, the willingness is there. Now the implementation is still lacking behind to some extent. And that's need to be fixed extremely quickly. Otherwise, we're going to face indeed significant issues in 3 years from now. Okay, whether that will stay or not after It's a bit early to say. I don't know. Frankly, if you ask me, I would answer, I do not know. Okay. I would hope so. Okay, I would hope so. As you said, I mean, this whole issue of digital health and how digital health has become and has demonstrated to be an efficient way of doing part of healthcare during the COVID. I would hope that was the best possible demonstration. It was a lively demonstration of the capacity of digital health. And that should continue, obviously, post-COVID. There again, there are discussions. Some states, yes, are willing to go with it. Others are a bit more reluctant because they say it was exceptional. Okay, so now the trick is how do we turn the exceptional into something which is normal? I mean, it has proved to work.
And I assume that has to be done by Germany. That can't be imposed by the EU.
Well, indeed. I mean, it's always the dilemma of Europe. I mean, it's a recommendation that comes out of the Commission to say, look, guys, if you want, you can use remote audit. Okay. Now, most countries would say, okay, great, we're going to do it, and some for some time their own personal reason say, no, we cannot because the text by itself doesn't say it as clearly as this.
Let me touch on the issue of clinical evidence, because that's something that a lot of companies are concerned about. And for many companies, they see that as the biggest change required by the MDR. In other words, the requirement of additional clinical evidence. So talk a little bit about that, and also the perspective of advising companies how important it is to make sure they kind of limit the approvals they're applying for the applications that they have clinical data that they can support. In other words, that the clinical data coincides, if you will, with what they're seeking the approvals for, as a way that companies can perhaps limit the amount of clinical evidence they have to provide.
Yeah, that's a very critical point to bring here. Indeed, I mean, this whole issue of clinical evidence. I mean, it is among the critical objective of this new regulation was to raise the bar in terms of clinical evidence, and that indeed that the clinical evidence produced was matching, they say, the request of indication. Okay, so don't. And don't try to ask for a wide indication with a teeny kind of very focused clinical evidence. This has to fit together. So the time of a little bit of clinical efficacy with a big indication, in my mind, that time is over. So now we have to be much more rigorous in terms of, okay, this is the indication, this is the clinical information you provide. You want a wider one, then you got to provide a wider clinical evidence. Okay, and that's a significant change indeed. And the biggest, for me, the biggest impact of this is the level of investment that you're going to put into your clinical evidence development. That's where I stand. I think that as an industry, we were always involved with clinical evidence, obviously, but now this is taking a new dimension. And the new dimension for me at the end is what? Fitting the two together, indication and requested indication or requested use and clinical evidence, okay? And enough of that clinical evidence that there is no ambiguity of it seems to indicate that, no, that will not be enough anymore. At the end, it will require bigger investment in clinical work and most probably more time. And most probably more time.
One point I wanted to maybe have you clarify, if you can, that I'm hearing from companies is the difference between the way panels are used under the MDR, because there's some confusion because it differs with the way panels are used by the FDA. And I think some companies don't quite grasp that difference. So I thought it'd be important for you to distinguish between those two.
Yeah, and frankly, that's a very unfortunate situation. I do think that the FDA has it right, if you want my point of view, in terms of opening up the discussion with industry to try to see how to best go around to be able to provide relatively fast access to innovation. And you need the dialogue. You need the dialogue to make sure that why not open communication to make sure that what you're going to do is the right thing to do versus letting you in the dark. And then once you've done, telling you, but it wasn't right. That I think is very, in today's world, I think it's stupid. We've tried to push for as much possible dialogue between the EU system and industry. And whether it's notified body dialogue with industry, competent authority dialogue with industry, I am indeed concerned, and I'm not very excited to how this new regulation is establishing the dialogue. There is very little dialogue, and the dialogue is absolutely zero commitment. And I would hope that this will change over time. I think it's wrong. I personally think it's wrong. We need the dialogue. And dialogue is okay, and dialogue can be controlled. And there is not always, unfortunately, let me put it this way. In Europe, many times people see the relation between industry and authorities as evil. I don't think so. It doesn't have to be evil. It can actually be the reverse. So we need also, the Europeans need also to change a bit their mind on this.
And just to add to what you're saying, for people who may not be as familiar, panel recommendations in the US with the FDA are simply that. They're simply recommendations.
Absolutely.
But my understanding is under the MDR, they are, if you will, mandatory. Right?
Well, I can already tell you one thing is we still have to understand how these panels are actually going to work. I mean, we understand that they've been somehow nominated. We have not seen anyone really working that so far. So it's going to be interesting in the next few months to see how this operates.
Right.
And frankly, I cannot imagine that there is no dialogue. I cannot. I mean, today there is dialogue between EMA and pharma companies.
Yeah, and again, let's hope that when you look at the U.S. example, I mean, the U.S. system has done a lot of things wrong over the years, but one area in which the FDA has, I think, and industry both agree now that has improved is in the area of increased dialogue and communication between industry and regulators.
Yeah, and that doesn't take away the final approval independency of panels or of system. But if it can improve speed to market, avoid doing things which are not needed, or have a better understanding of what one is trying to achieve or not, this is so much time gained for patients.
Thanks for listening so far. This interview will continue after this short message. Market Pathways is the #1 publication that covers the people, challenges, and opportunities impacting the global medical device regulatory, reimbursement, and policy spheres. MyStrategist.com is your digital home to access all of our coverage and read the latest issue of Market Pathways.
Let me touch on one area which is causing a lot of confusion. We knew going into this current deadline for MDR that Brexit was going to be an issue. I don't think, at least on this side of the pond, there was an anticipation that Switzerland might also be an issue. And you know, for people who aren't aware, Switzerland actually is home to a significant portion of the medical device community in Europe, both in terms of being the location of several large company headquarters, as well as housing a whole host of small startups. So it's not insignificant. Give us an update on where things stand in terms of Brexit, and were you surprised about the situation with Switzerland, and what does that mean in terms of MDR?
Okay, indeed, it seems like we go from Brexit to Switzerland, and in the midst of the wave between this, we fixed the issue with Turkey. So because Turkey was also an issue that has been fixed. Mm-hmm. So situation with Switzerland, yes, I mean it is. it is a little bit surprising to us that the authorities between the EU and Switzerland did not realize what they were getting into. Now, what is the issue? The issue is quite simple. The issue is that Switzerland has always had an agreement with Europe under the Medical Device Directive that you could, from Switzerland, distribute your product in Europe without having what they call a legal representation in Europe. You could have your legal representation in Switzerland, but you could still, basically, because your product was approved by a notified body, that could be a Swiss notified body or could be even a European notified body, but the legal representation was in Europe, was in Switzerland. Now, this was perfectly accepted under the Medical Device Directive. The problem is that under the Medical Device Regulation, this is not accepted anymore. So you need to have a legal representation in one of the EU member states to be able to commercialize. What was requested is that the product which are from Switzerland, okay, without a legal representation in Europe, but with a certificate, could benefit from the transition period, the 3 years, remember, up to 2024, to get into basically the new regulation, like any other products could benefit from it. Well, the problem is that to do that, you needed to amend a document, okay, which would recognize that possibility. Now, got involved into this a bigger issue, which is the relation between EU and Switzerland on very big subject like movement of people and so on. And that little piece of thing is part of this bigger agreement. We had hoped that this would be solved because in the interest of patients, okay, it is just a matter of a few hours and you technically fix it. The issue is, it's not a technical issue. It's a political issue. It's a political issue where the system got caught into the larger consideration of EU-Switzerland relation. And let's face it, on this, it seems that both sides are right now breaking their communication. And, you know, we will continue to try to convince the authorities to say, come on, you know, what, at least allow products to benefit from the transition period. Allow this, okay. Treat Switzerland the same way you are treating product coming from other places, which basically are under the same system. Right now, the situation is not looking very good, let's face it, because the communication is a bit broken between EU and Switzerland. I wish I could say, look, don't worry, this is going to be fixed. We said that, unfortunately, many times because, again, technically, it is such an easy thing to fix. Okay, so easy. But there is much bigger things in the midst here. Now, it means that essentially, now many companies anticipated on it. Okay, we advise companies to anticipate. And the way you could anticipate on this is don't rely only on your legal representation in Switzerland. Open up, have a legal representation in one of the 27 member states. If you have that, okay, you might need to change a bit your labeling, but then you are okay. Then you can take your product out of Switzerland into Europe without a problem. Okay. Now, not all companies have wanted to do that. Okay. And there is not a problem going from Europe to Switzerland. That's okay, fine. So it's very unfortunate. It's there. We have to deal with it. Let's hope that people will get to a reasonable thinking at a point in time, saying, okay, we understand that we have differences. We may have patients at stakes. And you know what? It is not Swiss patients which are at stakes here. It is European patients which are at stakes. It is European patients. So, you know, for me, it's a totally crazy situation. Politically, maybe, but for the good sake of patient, it makes no sense.
Let's talk about Brexit a little bit, because obviously this is one that was anticipated, and in fact, there were examples of notified bodies that moved or relocated from the UK to the continent. Yeah. What's the current situation, and what has the impact of Brexit been?
Okay, so far, I mean, should say so far so good. We don't see too much of the Brexit here, which basically has an impact. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of companies have very strongly anticipated over what could be happening over Brexit. Now, let's face it also, the UK and Europe are going to continue to recognize the products and the product approval and the CE marking, I think, for the next 2 years. So I think that we're potentially okay for the next 2 years. I'm still waiting to see what's going to happen in 2023. Okay, which direction is this going to go? What direction is going to take the UK is going to take in terms of an approval system? Is it a more FDA kind of system? Is it a more European kind of system? Is it something in between? Okay, it is totally open. So on top of it, I think a lot of the companies had built significant stocks of products in the system to anticipate and to buffer the effect. So right now, we don't see big issues. It is a bit more complicated. Things might take, again, more time at the border and stuff because there is more documentation. I think it is potentially more complicated for companies which are producing, let's say, which are producing in the UK, because obviously they have to import different kind of products, transform the product in the UK, and then ship it back to Europe. But on that front, so far, let's touch wood, it seems to be going along relatively well.
Okay, let me wrap up. I've asked you a lot of questions about concerns and questions that people have about MDR. Let me kind of flip the switch and talk about the positive aspects of the new rule. Whether that is increased data collection and availability, more clinical evidence, greater transparency. Talk a little bit about some of the positive factors that, once the kinks get worked out, so to speak, we'll see from the new MDR.
Well, I think that for me, some of the most positive thing is going to be trust in the system by patients, patients, trust that we have quality products available, safe products, efficacious products available, that we don't have to wonder every other day, okay, whether it's okay or not, okay, which has been the case in the past, okay, and that the CE marking process, which has this recognition across the world, because it is not only about Europe, it's also many other countries across the world are using CE marking process, that continues to be, and that continues to be solid, that you don't get questioned every other day in terms of, is this right or wrong? You cannot move on with a system, focus on the innovation, okay? If every other day people are saying, yeah, but it's not good, it's not good enough, we need to do this, we need to do that, because you lose again the predictability of this thing. And so I hope that with the new system, we have a strong, solid, very qualified system, recognized, that people can use across the world and without having to doubt on good or bad. And for the end, for the good sake of patients should feel safe.
I know you don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not going to ask you.
I wish.
And I'm not going to ask you as far as specific dates for product approvals. But I would be interested in, and I think the industry be interested in your perspective on how long you think it will take for MDR to settle into some kind of status quo, because at some point this will become business as usual for everyone in the MedTech ecosystem, for
Yes.
product companies, for investors, for entrepreneurs, for clinicians. And I think a lot of people are just wondering, we know that eventually this will kind of settle down. And from your perspective, how long do you think that'll roughly take until we get to some kind of business as usual?
A lot of people are going to kill me on this one. Huh? You know that. Look, it's obviously, I mean, it's, as you said, I wish I could be very precise on this. I would tell you, I will escape the full answer by telling you that there is a due date for that. The due date in my mind is May 2024, right? Ideally, minus at least a year, because, you know, I mean, it's, if you tell me the system is ready the day, it's not useful. So I would hope that we could settle all this down within the next 2 years so that we are ready with anticipation on May 2024. I hope profoundly. I think that we should put everything we can. And if we cannot, then we'll have to accept flexibility in terms of how we implement all this. Okay. So, you know, 2 years, 3 years. Okay. People might say, but this is way too long. I'm trying to be as realistic as possible in view of what I see. I think that I have said, and I've please ask, whether it's the Commission, whether it's the member states, don't cut on resources now, because this famous date of May 26, 2021 is passed. It's actually now that you have to put even more resources to get this thing going. If we want to fix it and to get it quickly, let's say out of this breaking in period, we need to put the resources now. We need to fix it, hopefully within the next 2 years. Anyway, we have no choice than to have a system that works in May 2024. And worst now, we need to get a system that works in a year from now for the IVDs.
Serge, I want to thank you very much. And I have to point out to our listeners, and many of whom have been part of our conversations over the years, whether they be in person at our conferences or interviews that we've done in our publication, but you have always been a realistic voice and not someone who looks at this through rose-colored glasses. So we very much appreciate the honesty that you've always brought to this discussion, and also all the work that you and your team at MedTech Europe have done over the years in anticipation of MDR. And I know that you'll continue to do that now that MDR is effective and we move ahead. And I would urge anybody who has any questions about any aspect of MDR or IVDR to reach out to Serge and his team at MedTech Europe, because they really are the most knowledgeable group on what's happening. So with that, Serge, let me thank you very much, and we'll conclude this podcast.
Watch the full interview and become a part of our global MedTech community on mystrategist.com.